There are women whose names have survived 1,000 years, not because they were born into power, or because they accumulated it, or because the world they inhabited gave them the kinds of formal authority that history tends to record, but because they did something, in a specific moment, that was so completely itself, so entirely an expression of who they were, rather than who the world required them to be, that the doing became a thing impossible to forget. Shizuka Gozen was such a woman. She was a dancer, not a dancer in the court sense, not someone trained in the formal choreographies of the imperial tradition, but a dancer in the more fundamental sense, someone whose relationship to movement and music, and the space between sound and silence, was the primary language through which she experienced what it meant to be alive. She was called the greatest dancer of her age. This was not merely an honorific. In the world of the late Heian and early Kamakura periods, performance was not entertainment in the modern sense, but a form of communication between the human and the sacred. The ordinary vocabulary of speech could not achieve what the greatest dancers could, and the greatest dancer occupied a position that had real weight and real significance. Shizuka Gozen occupied that position. She met Yoshitsune in the capital. The circumstances of the meeting are described with the imprecision that attaches to meetings no one knew would become significant. The imprecision of an encounter that seemed, in the moment, like one of the many that the mobile and unpredictable social world of that period produced. Yoshitsune was the most celebrated commander of his generation. He was also, by the time he and Shizuka Gozen met, a man whose situation was changing in ways he was not fully equipped to manage. His victories had produced a fame that his brother Yoritomo was finding increasingly difficult to regard, the particular discomfort of someone who has more power than the person beside them, but is being spoken of as though the reverse were true. Shizuka Gozen saw Yoshitsune. She had seen many men of the court, many men of power and accomplishment, many men who carried themselves with the particular quality that power and accomplishment produce. Yoshitsune was different, not in the obvious ways that made the accounts of him so consistent in their descriptions, not primarily in the beauty or the physical quickness, or the quality of movement that marked him as unlike other men, different in a way she recognized from her own experience of the thing she did best, the way that certain people exist in full relationship with what they are doing, always in that thing rather than merely performing it. Yoshitsune was always in whatever he was doing. She recognized this, and the recognition was the beginning of everything that followed. What grew between them was not the careful managed exchange of sentiment that the court's conventions for such relationships prescribed. It was something less managed and more specific, the kind of connection that forms between people who recognize in each other a quality of full presence that each of them has found rare in their experience of the world. They were both people who gave themselves completely to what they did, Yoshitsune to the fighting and the strategy and the complete immersion in the problem before him, Shizuka Gozen to the dance, to the movement and the music and the communication with something beyond what ordinary speech could reach. The completeness in each of them recognized the completeness in the other. What formed between them was a relationship organized not around the social calculations that governed most relationships around them, but around something more direct and more difficult to manage. Shizuka Gozen traveled with Yoshitsune. This was unusual. A woman of her position and her accomplishments did not typically travel with a military commander, did not typically become part of the mobile and dangerous world that campaign and its aftermath produced. She chose to. The choice was hers, made with the full understanding of what it meant and what it risked, and the making of it tells us something important about who Shizuka Gozen was. The campaign against the Taira succeeded. The remarkable military achievements of Yoshitsune's command, the dash at Ichinotani, the night attack at Yashima, the decisive engagement at Danura where the Taira were finally broken, all of these produced a Yoshitsune who was at the height of his fame and at the beginning of his fall. Shizuka Gozen watched the change in Yoshitsune's situation with the attentiveness of someone who loved him. From the outside of the dynamic between the two brothers, she understood things that Yoshitsune himself could not entirely see because he was too much inside them. She saw Yoritomo's attitude changing. She saw the way the accusations accumulated, and the way Yoshitsune's responses to them revealed a man who was not equipped for the particular kind of warfare that Yoritomo was conducting. Yoshitsune fought battles. Yoritomo managed power, and in the management of power, Yoritomo had no equal. Shizuka Gozen was afraid, not for herself primarily, though the fear that attaches to a situation in which the person one loves is in danger is never entirely free of self-reference. Afraid for Yoshitsune, with the specific quality of fear that belongs to someone who can see what is coming and who is not in a position to prevent it. The flight began. The flight was the consequence of the political process that Yoritomo had conducted with the patience and skill he brought to everything political. Yoshitsune's position at court had been eroded, his allies given reasons to withdraw, the ground beneath him removed piece by piece until there was no longer any ground to stand on. Shizuka Gozen was with him when the flight began. She was with the small group that set out from the capital in the way that fugitives set out, quickly and without the ceremony that departure normally required, carrying what could be carried and leaving behind what could not. The road they took went south and then into the mountains, toward Yoshitsune's hope of sanctuary. It was winter, the mountain passes were deep in snow, and the cold was the cold of the high places, a cold that the body registers not just as temperature, but as the particular indifference of the physical world to human plans and human needs. Shizuka Gozen was not a woman accustomed to this kind of travel. She had lived in the capital, in the refined and sheltered world of performance and court connection, in a world where the management of physical comfort was a sophisticated art. She traveled through the snow because Yoshitsune was traveling through the snow, and because she had chosen, with the completeness that characterized everything she did, to be where he was. Part 2. Yoshino is a place of cedar forests and mountain paths where the snow comes early and stays late. The silence between the trees has a quality that the silence of flat places does not have, a depth and resonance that comes from the height and the particular way the mountains hold whatever is placed within them. Yoshitsune's group reached Yoshino in the deep winter. They reached it in the desperate condition of people who have been moving through difficult terrain and difficult weather, constantly aware that those searching for them were not far behind. The monastery at Yoshino was supposed to be a place of temporary refuge, a place where they could pause and consider what to do next. The monks of Yoshino were not inclined to shelter a fugitive. This was understandable. Sheltering a man whom Yoritomo wanted found was not a choice that a monastery could make without consequences, and the consequences that Yoritomo was capable of imposing were real and serious, and the monks understood this clearly. Yoshitsune's group was turned away. They had to move on, to keep moving, to find another route and another possible direction in which safety might exist. And it was here, at Yoshino, in the cold and the urgency of a situation that was becoming more desperate rather than less, that Yoshitsune and Shizuka Gozen understood that they could not continue together. The decision was not made lightly. It was made with the full understanding of what it meant, the full recognition that separating in these conditions was not a decision that came with any guarantee of outcome on either side. The people searching for them were moving through the same territory. Shizuka Gozen's presence in the group was making the group more visible. A woman traveling with a group of men through mountain territory in winter was a detail that attracted attention, a detail that the people searching for Yoshitsune would remember and report. Yoshitsune needed to be as invisible as possible. Shizuka Gozen made that invisibility harder to achieve. This was the practical calculation. But behind the practical calculation was something else, something that the practical calculation could not entirely account for, which was the question of what would happen to Shizuka Gozen if she remained with the group and the group was found. The answer to that question was not one that Yoshitsune could accept as a possibility. He could accept many things. He had accepted many things in the months of flight, had absorbed losses and hardships and diminishments that would have broken a less resilient person. He could not accept the possibility of Shizuka Gozen being taken because she had refused to leave his side. They said goodbye at Yoshino. The accounts of this parting carry a quality of weight that suggests even the people who wrote them, working from a distance of years, understood that they were describing something that mattered. They did not have direct knowledge of what was said and felt in that specific moment, but they wrote with the care of people who knew. Shizuka Gozen wept. This is stated plainly in the accounts, without apology or elaboration, because it is the kind of fact that does not require embellishment. She wept at Yoshino, in the snow, in the cold, in the shadow of the cedar trees, in the moment when Yoshitsune turned away from her to continue in the direction that his situation required him to go. Yoshitsune left. He moved into the mountain landscape with the small group that remained around him, and the trees closed behind him, and Shizuka Gozen was alone. Alone in a way that was different from the ordinary alone. Alone in a way that was organized around an absence, the specific absence of the person she had followed into the mountains, the person she had chosen with the completeness she brought to everything. She was alone on a mountain in winter with the snow falling and the sound of her own weeping, and the knowledge that the direction Yoshitsune had gone was a direction she could not follow. She came down from the mountain. She came down alone, which was itself a feat. Coming down from Yoshino in winter, without the resources or the support of the group she had been traveling with, required the kind of resilience that not everyone who has lived a sheltered life has access to when the shelter is removed. Shizuka Gozen had access to it. She had a quality that her years of training had produced, not the physical training of a warrior, but the discipline that a dancer's life required. The discipline of the body made responsive to demands the ordinary body is not capable of meeting. the discipline of being present in difficult conditions without the ordinary protections that people use to manage difficulty. She came down from Yoshino and she was captured. The people who captured her were Yoritomo's agents, people who had been searching the area with the specific intelligence that a woman matching Shizuka Gozen's description had been traveling with Yoshitsune's group. She was taken. She was taken not because she had been careless or because she had made a mistake. The force arrayed against Yoshitsune was very large, and she was alone, and the outcome of a single woman in the mountains against a systematic search was the outcome that systematic searches tend to produce. She was taken to Kamakura. Kamakura was where Yoritomo had established the center of his power, the eastern city that was the seat of the new military government. It was in every way different from Kyoto, different in its landscape and buildings and culture, and its sense of what mattered. Shizuka Gozen arrived in Kamakura as a captive. She arrived as a woman who had been found in Yoshitsune's company, who had traveled with him through the mountains, who had chosen to be with him when better judgment might have counseled a different choice. This was the case against her, such as it was. She had loved Yoshitsune. She had followed him. She had refused, until the situation made it impossible, to be separated from him. These were the facts, and the question of what to do with these facts, how to treat a woman who had committed no crime except the crime of loyalty to a man Yoritomo had decided to destroy, was a question that Kamakura had to answer. Yoritomo's answer, initially, was to make Shizuka Gozen perform. He ordered her to dance, and what happened when Shizuka Gozen danced at Tsurugaoka Hachimangu is the thing that history has preserved with the most care and returned to with the most frequency of anything in her story. Part 3. Tsurugaoka Hachimangu is a shrine that sits at the center of Kamakura. It was, in Yoritomo's new order, not merely a religious site but a political one, the place where the power of the new military government expressed itself in ceremony and in the rituals that gave that government its connection to the sacred authority that political power requires. Yoritomo ordered Shizuka Gozen to dance there. The order was delivered with the full weight of his authority, which was now the greatest authority in Japan. The context was a formal ceremony, a public occasion at which the most prominent figures of Yoritomo's government and court would be present. What Yoritomo wanted from the performance is not entirely clear. Perhaps he wanted to demonstrate his control over everything, including the woman who had traveled through the mountains with the man he was pursuing. Perhaps he wanted the performance as a kind of trophy, evidence that the world Yoshitsune had inhabited was now entirely within his power to display and to dispose of as he chose. Perhaps he simply appreciated Shizuka Gozen's talent and wanted to see it exercised under his authority. The specific motivation is less important than the specific response. Shizuka Gozen danced. She danced at Tsurugaoka Hachimangu, before Yoritomo and Masako and the assembled court of Kamakura, and what she performed was not the performance that Yoritomo had requested or expected. She sang. The song she sang was a song about Yoshitsune, not obliquely, not with the kind of indirection that court performance normally employed when the subject was politically sensitive. Directly, she sang about her love for Yoshitsune, about the separation at Yoshino, about the snow and the cold and the cedar trees, and the quality of the absence that the separation had created. She sang as a woman who has chosen the thing she is doing with the completeness that makes choice real. She had understood what the performance she was giving was, and she gave it anyway, in front of the most powerful man in Japan, in the full knowledge of what the giving of it might produce. The court was silent. Yoritomo was not silent. Yoritomo was furious. What Shizuka Gozen had done was not merely impolite. It was a direct and public declaration in front of the entire court of Kamakura that her loyalty was not to Yoritomo, but to the man Yoritomo was hunting. Her love for Yoshitsune was not a thing she was prepared to conceal or apologize for or reframe into something less threatening to the person sitting before her. It was, in the terms of that world, a provocation. It was the kind of provocation that could, and perhaps should, have had the most serious consequences. Yoritomo moved to impose those consequences. But here, at the moment of potential catastrophe, a different figure entered the story. Masako spoke. Masako was Yoritomo's wife, the woman who had been born as the daughter of Yoshitsune's captor, and who had become, through her own formidable intelligence and will, one of the most significant political figures of the period. She was not a woman who deferred to her husband in matters she considered important, and she considered this important. Masako said something that the accounts have preserved with care because it deserved to be preserved. She said that anyone who has loved someone understands what Shizuka Gozen had just expressed. She said that the feeling behind the performance was a feeling that every person who has loved and been separated from the person they loved would recognize. The expression of that feeling, however politically inconvenient, was not something that deserved punishment. She spoke with the directness that Masako was known for. She spoke with the authority that a woman of her position could bring to bear, in a moment when bringing it to bear was the difference between justice and its absence. Yoritomo listened. This is significant, because Yoritomo was not generally a man who changed his course in response to opposition, was not generally a man who found the arguments of others sufficient reason to revise a decision he had already made. But Masako was not others. Masako was Masako, and the particular quality of her intervention, the combination of personal authority and the articulation of something genuine about the human experience of love and loss, reached Yoritomo in a way that nothing else could have. Shizuka Gozen was not punished. What Shizuka Gozen felt in the aftermath of the performance is not something the accounts record directly, but it is not difficult to imagine. She had done what she had done. She had stood in the shrine at the center of the power of the man who was hunting the person she loved, and she had sung that person's name. She had not looked away, had not apologized, had not reframed what she felt into something that would have been safer to express. She had been, in that moment, exactly herself. Not the self that the world required of her, not the self that survival and prudence would have recommended, the self that she actually was, the dancer whose relationship to truth and expression was so fundamental. When the choice came between expressing it and suppressing it, she expressed it, even here, even now, even in front of the most dangerous audience she would ever perform for. The performance at Tsurugaoka Hachimangu is the thing that history has remembered, not because it was the most technically accomplished thing Shizuka Gozen ever did, but because it was the most completely her. Part 4. Shizuka Gozen was with child. This fact, which becomes known in Kamakura in the aftermath of the performance at Tsurugaoka Hachimangu, adds a dimension to everything that had happened and everything that was still to happen, that the performance itself did not contain. The child was Yoshitsune's. It had been conceived in the time before the flight, or in the early days of it, in the time when the situation had not yet reached the point of complete impossibility, and there was still some space in which the ordinary human things were possible. Shizuka Gozen was now in Kamakura, the child of the man Yoritomo was hunting growing within her, and the situation that this created was one that even Masako's intervention at the shrine had not addressed, and could not easily address. Yoritomo's position on the child was determined by the same logic that had determined his position on Yoshitsune himself. The child of Yoshitsune was a potential claimant, a potential point of resistance, a potential beginning of something that Yoritomo had decided should not begin. Masako was pregnant herself at this time, or had been recently, and the accounts suggest that her intervention on Shizuka Gozen's behalf at the shrine had a personal dimension that went beyond the general principle she had articulated. She understood, at a level that was not merely political or philosophical, what it meant to carry a child, and to be uncertain about that child's future. She understood what it meant to love the person whose child you were carrying, and she extended to Shizuka Gozen the protection that she could extend, which was real and significant, but which had limits. Limits determined by the boundaries of Yoritomo's tolerance and by the requirements of the political situation that had made everything in the world of Kamakura what it was. Shizuka Gozen was treated with a degree of consideration that her situation might not otherwise have produced. She was housed, she was not mistreated, she was given the conditions under which she could wait for the child to arrive. But the waiting was the waiting of someone who did not know what would happen to the child when it arrived, who knew that the decision was not hers to make, and that the person who would make it had reasons to make it in a particular way. The child was born. It was a boy. A boy born to Shizuka Gozen in Kamakura was, in the terms of Yoritomo's political calculation, a son of Yoshitsune, a potential heir of the Minamoto clan's most famous warrior, a focus around which resistance might eventually form. Yoritomo's decision was the decision that his political logic required. The child was taken. He was taken to the sea. The accounts describe this with the brevity that the most devastating things sometimes receive, the brevity of a fact so terrible that elaboration would be a kind of insult to its weight. The child did not survive. Shizuka Gozen lost the child in the way that she had lost Yoshitsune, not through any failure of love or commitment, but through the operation of a power that was larger than her love and commitment, and that did not take those things into account when it made its calculations. She had lost Yoshitsune to the mountains and the winter, and Yoritomo's patient political destruction. She had lost the child to the sea. Masako mourned with her. This is stated in the accounts with the plainness that genuine feeling tends to produce in records that have been written with care and honesty, the plainness of a fact that does not need to be dressed up to be significant. Masako was a woman who had navigated the most demanding political environment of her time, with a skill and a toughness that very few people of any gender possessed. She was also a mother, and the loss of a child is a loss that crosses the boundaries between the politically powerful and the politically powerless, a loss that finds the human being inside the political position and is felt there, specifically and without qualification. Masako mourned with Shizuka Gozen, and this mourning, this shared grief between the wife of the most powerful man in Japan and the woman who had loved the man that powerful man was hunting, is one of the most human moments in a story that has many human moments. It does not resolve anything. It does not undo what was done. But it is there, in the accounts, preserved because the people who wrote the accounts understood that it mattered, that the fact of two women mourning together in the center of political power was a fact worth preserving. Shizuka Gozen remained in Kamakura for a time. She remained in the care of Masako's protection, in the strange position of a woman who had been the enemy of the man in power and had been treated with more consideration than enmity might have suggested was available. The news of Yoshitsune's death reached Kamakura. The news of the events at Koromogawa, the attack and the fire and the end of everything that Yoshitsune had been and done, came in the way that news of distant events came in that period, slowly, with the particular quality of information that has traveled a long distance and been changed by the traveling. Shizuka Gozen received the news. What she felt, the accounts do not say directly. They preserve the fact of the news reaching her, and they preserve what happened afterward, which is that Shizuka Gozen was eventually released from Kamakura, was allowed to return to the world that lay outside the seat of Yoritomo's power. She went. The direction she went, and what she did after she left, is the subject of the accounts that have accumulated around her name in the centuries since, accounts that disagree with each other in their details, and that cannot all be true. Part 5. The accounts of Shizuka Gozen's life after Kamakura diverge. This is characteristic of figures who become legendary, whose stories attract the retrospective attention of people who want to know what happened next. Finding the records incomplete, they fill in the gaps with what seems possible, or what seems appropriate, or what the meaning of the story seems to require. Some accounts say she returned to the capital. Some accounts say she became a nun. Some accounts say she died young, not long after the events at Kamakura, in the specific way that people in stories sometimes die, when the story has reached a point where continuing it seems like a diminishment of what has already happened. What can be said with some confidence is that Shizuka Gozen did not simply disappear. The name was too significant by then, the performance at Tsurugaoka Hachimangu too widely known, the story too resonant with things that people of that period and subsequent periods found important, for her to have simply vanished without leaving some trace. She continued, "The shape of the continuing is uncertain, but the continuing itself is not." The song she sang at Tsurugaoka Hachimangu has been preserved, not the melody, which belongs to a tradition of performance that does not survive in recorded form from that period, but the words of the song that Shizuka Gozen sang in front of Yoritomo, expressing her love for Yoshitsune in the most politically dangerous setting she would ever occupy, have come down through the centuries as one of the most famous poems in Japanese history. Shizuka and Yoshitsune, the poem names them both, names their relationship, names the quality of the feeling that the relationship produced. It does this in the compressed and resonant way that the Japanese poetic tradition does these things, in 17 or 31 syllables. In the form of the tanka, It manages to contain within its small space something that prose would take pages to approach and might never quite reach. The poem is the proof that the performance happened. It is the record of the moment when Shizuka Gozen chose expression over prudence, when she made the choice that has defined her in memory ever since. Masako's role in Shizuka Gozen's story deserves more attention than it sometimes receives. Masako was a figure of extraordinary historical significance in her own right, a woman who would outlive Yoritomo and become one of the central powers of early Japanese history. She is sometimes called the Amashugun, the nun shogun, whose political intelligence and force of will shaped the government of Japan for decades. She was also a woman who, in the middle of the most dramatic period of her husband's consolidation of power, found the time and the will to intervene on behalf of another woman's grief. The intervention was not trivial. Yoritomo was furious at the performance at Tsurugaoka Hachimangu. The fury of the most powerful man in Japan directed at a woman in his custody was not a force that was easily turned. Masako turned it. She turned it with the argument that the argument deserved, with the appeal to something in Yoritomo that was capable of recognizing what everyone in the shrine had witnessed, and of responding to it with something other than political calculation. Whether the response she produced in him was genuine recognition or simply the result of her specific authority over him is not something the accounts resolve. What the accounts preserve is the result. Shizuka Gozen's story has been told and retold for more than 800 years. It has been told in poetry and in drama, in the theatrical traditions of No and Kabuki, in the illustrated narratives that the Japanese tradition produced in such abundance, in the modern forms of storytelling that have taken up the older stories and found in them things that remain relevant. The reason for the telling is not difficult to understand. It is the story of a woman who, when placed in a situation that called for accommodation and self-erasure, refused. Not dramatically, not with the kind of confrontation that produces obvious conflict. She refused in the most completely herself way available, which was to dance, to sing, to express, in the medium she knew best, exactly what she felt for the person she loved, in front of the person who was his enemy, without apology, without reframing, without the self-protective management of expression that survival in difficult situations usually requires. The refusal is what has made her memorable. Not the suffering, though there was suffering. Not the loss, though there was loss. The refusal. There is a quality that the people the world remembers tend to have in common. Not intelligence, though many of them are intelligent. Not power, though some of them have power. Not even courage, though what they do often requires courage. The quality is this: they are entirely themselves in the moment that matters. They do not calculate the response that will serve their interests. They do not manage the expression of what they feel into something more acceptable. They are, in the crucial moment, without remainder, what they actually are. Shizuka Gozen was this. She was it on a bridge at Yoshino, weeping in the snow for the person who was moving away from her into the mountains. She was it in the shrine at Kamakura, singing the name of the man she loved in front of the man who wanted him dead. She was it in the grief that followed, the grief that did not have the comfort of resolution or the consolation of meaning. Simply grief, honest and without remainder, the grief of someone who has loved and lost and knows the difference between the two. She was a dancer. She danced as herself all the way to the end. Part 6. The world that Shizuka Gozen had inhabited did not survive long after she left it. Yoritomo's new order transformed Japan in ways that the court at Kyoto had not anticipated and could not fully absorb, and the long process of that transformation produced a Japan very different from the one in which Shizuka Gozen and Yoshitsune had found each other. The old court culture continued for centuries, maintained by its own internal momentum and by the particular genius of the Japanese tradition for preserving forms even as their content changes. But the world of those forms was no longer the world of power. Power had moved east to Kamakura, and then later to other centers as history worked its way through the centuries, and the Kyoto that remained was a preserved thing, beautiful and increasingly distant from the reality that the rest of Japan was living. Shizuka Gozen belonged to the transition. She lived in the moment when one world was ending and another was beginning, and her story is marked by that transition, by the gap between the world that produced her and the world that she found herself in at Kamakura. The no play that tells her story was written centuries after her death. It was written by a playwright who understood that the story of Shizuka Gozen at Tsurugaoka Hachimangu was not primarily a political story, not primarily a story about the conflict between Yoshitsune and Yoritomo, or between the old court culture and the new military government. It was a love story. It was a story about what love looks like when it has been reduced to its most essential element, when everything that is not love has been stripped away by circumstances, when the only thing left is the choice between expressing what is felt and suppressing it. The play preserves what history preserved, the dance and the song and the silence of the court, and the fury of Yoritomo and the intervention of Masako. It places these things in the context that the theatrical tradition of No provides, the context of spirits and memory, the particular way that the Japanese classical tradition understands the relationship between the living and the dead, between the present and the past. In the world of No, Shizuka Gozen dances still. What does it mean to be remembered as she is remembered? It means that the thing she did at Tsurugaoka Hachimangu was recognized immediately and permanently as the kind of thing that matters, not as a political act, though it had political dimensions, not as a brave act, though it required something that looks like courage, as an act of complete self-expression, an act in which a person became entirely what they were in a moment that called for something else, an act that said, without words, that there are things more important than survival, and more important than prudence, and more important than the management of one's situation in the eyes of the most powerful person in the room. There are things that must be expressed. There are feelings that must be given form. There are moments when the dancer must dance, even here, even now, even knowing what the dance might cost. Shizuka Gozen danced, and the dance is still being seen. Yoshitsune is remembered as the greatest warrior Japan ever produced. Benkei is remembered as the greatest act of loyalty. Shizuka Gozen is remembered as the dancer who would not bow. Three people whose stories are inseparable from each other, who came together in the turbulent years of the Genpei no Tatakai, and who each, in their own way, chose what they were over what they were required to be. Yoshitsune chose the battlefield, where he was entirely himself, over the political world, where he could not be. Benkei chose his master, completely and without remainder, over everything else the world offered. Shizuka Gozen chose the song, in the most dangerous setting imaginable, over the silence that would have been safer and smaller and less her. Together they constitute a story that Japan has told and retold for 8 centuries, because the story contains something that does not age, something that each generation finds in it that speaks to their own experience of what it means to choose what you are when the world asks you to be something else. The cherry blossoms fall at Yoshino still, the river moves through Uji still, the shrine at Kamakura stands, and the place where Shizuka Gozen danced is still there, marked by the memory of what happened on a day in the late 12th century when a woman refused the role that the most powerful man in Japan had assigned her and gave instead the performance that was true. History has a way of keeping the things that deserve to be kept. Not everything, not even most things, but some things, the things that have the particular quality of being completely themselves, the things that were done not for the record, but simply because they were the things that needed to be done. Shizuka Gozen's dance needed to be done. She danced it, and the world, which had not asked for it and did not know it needed it, has been keeping it ever since.